Lords of the Fallen feels like the ideal form of Dark Souls 2, where it prioritizes exploration, making levels more of the challenge than bosses, but unlike Dark Souls 2, combat and movement actually feels pretty good. I've beaten the game 5 times now using about 4.5 different builds, and once I got used to combat, I came to enjoy it quite a bit more than I expected I would. Although Lords of the Fallen obviously heavily borrows from the Soulsborne genre, I think it really stands out on its own when it takes a break from the traditional formula and does its own thing. So, for example, rather than taking chip damage when blocking an enemy attack, in Lords of the Fallen you receive withered HP damage. Now, withered HP damage is a portion of the HP bar which will turn gray when you block or get hit by certain enemy attacks. You can recover withered HP by hitting enemies, similarly to the rally mechanic in Bloodborne, or you can lose it all if you get hit by an enemy attack and take the normal damage on top of it. This adds a layer of depth to combat where there's an intrinsic sense of risk versus reward in that hitting an enemy will allow you to regain your HP and save yourself from using a potion versus the danger of getting struck and being in a worse position than you started. This plays into exploration as well. Whenever the player dies or chooses to go into Umbral, they will transform and regain all of their HP, except half of it will be withered HP initially. When fighting certain enemies, you might keep in mind that you want to transition into the Umbral world shortly, so you might elect to not heal because you know if you die, you'll just be in the Umbral world anyway, which might be something that you need to do eventually, so it adds an extra layer of complexity of trying to figure out whether or not you want to heal against an enemy, potentially die and be okay with that, or whether or not you want to press the attack to regain your withered HP at different integrals of the game. Now, whenever you transition into Umbral, you lose access to having a second life, so it adds a lot of tension into exploration when you're no longer in Axiom. So, naturally, the developers have designed the levels in such a way where there's going to be times where you want to be in Umbral to proceed, and then transfer back into Axiom to be safer. I know a lot of players have had issues with Umbral in not quite understanding why there's a kind of timer there or why the enemies keep on respawning. Naturally, it's so that way people just don't stay in Umbral for the most part to explore freely and do whatever they need to do. One gripe that I do have about the level design, which I think is very stellar otherwise, is that I do wish there was a little bit more interplay between Axiom and Umbral, because the majority of time you need to explore and progress through an area, it will be better served in Umbral than Axiom. One other way Lords of the Fallen sets itself apart from other Soulsborne titles is how it's included the posture system into the game. Unlike Elden Ring, where you can't exactly see an enemy's stance or posture, in Lords of the Fallen, the lock-on indicator actually has the posture bar built into it, which I think is an absolutely brilliant piece of game design that I wish FromSoft will incorporate into their future titles moving forward. It did take me a really long time to understand how the posture system was implemented into Lords of the Fallen, which is kind of a bad thing. But once I gained access to an item which allowed me to deal a lot more posture damage with holy damage, it really opened my eyes into how well integrated the game it really is, provided you have the means to interact with it, which not all builds are able to do so, unfortunately. So, being able to break open an enemy's posture with a charged R2, or to crack open a depleted enemy's posture with a kick, really helped change the way that I approach some combat mechanics or like some enemy encounters in a way that I really didn't expect. And on my final playthrough of the game, I did the biggest bonk build that I possibly could because I really just enjoyed being able to crush open enemies ad nauseum before they could even do anything against me. It's difficult talking about the pacing of combat in Lords of the Fallen because it's simultaneously fast yet slow. Now, What I mean by that is its movement speed is pretty quick and is comparable to Dark Souls 3, and there is a little bit of twitchiness in trying to evade enemy attacks. However, it's also slow in that attacking enemies is something that needs to be done deliberately because there's not a lot of animation cancels to evade enemy attacks if you're already locked into your own attack. So this can be a good or a bad thing based on individual preference, because I feel like the games like this, which are slower, do feel a bit more fair in that they're almost more turn-based in that you kind of need to approach combat a certain way in order to succeed, but I definitely recognize that isn't a style of play that everyone enjoys. I think my biggest complaint about combat is that it takes longer to execute a block than it does to execute a dodge, because this leads into very awkward situations where you know you can dodge an enemy attack, but it's more advantageous if you block it and try to parry the enemy attack to deal posture damage. But if you try to do so based on the timing of a dodge, you're going to get smacked, and it's going to be very painful trying to make that kind of adjustment into combat. So this ties back into the whole posture system, which makes it harder to interact with, because if the game is passively teaching players to roll away from enemy attacks rather than blocking them, they're going to rely on rolls because they're more effective than blocks in general. There is already that kind of intrinsic risk versus reward with blocking that's a little bit different than dodging, so I just don't understand why it takes so many more frames to block an attack than it does to roll away from it. Now, it doesn't take that long to block an enemy attack, but it does feel really frustrating when you know your timing was fine if your timing was based on a dodge rather than a block, which is not very apparent based on what one would expect. Nonetheless, I still think the marriage between blocking, parrying, and taking withered damage is beautifully done, and I think it's really disappointing that the game passively teaches players to work away from interacting with that system. Alright, setting all that stuff aside, I'm going to go ahead and start moving into some issues that I have with the game. This one's a little awkward to talk about because whenever you beat the game, you will gain access to a new class which you can start a new game with. However, if you take that new class and play a new game, you might be kind of hamstringing yourself from obtaining certain achievements because it's better to do them all on one character rather than spreading them out between different ones. So I don't really have issues with like having new classes and stuff, but I do think it inadvertently funnels people away from unlocking achievements because they're not account-based rather than character-based. So, long story short, make achievements account-based, not character-based. It's stupid, especially when you're telling people to play different characters. That also ties into the beginning classes. I didn't realize whenever I picked my very first character that their rebirth stats would be locked onto their kind of main stats. So if you pick like the Orion Preacher or the Inferno dude, you'll have either 18 Radiance stat or Inferno stat, and that can never be lowered if you picked that as your starting class, which isn't like a deal breaker, but it's just not what I would have expected. Anyway, pick your first class well, and keep in mind what stats you want to use for new games in the future. There's kind of a lot to talk about with New Game Plus. While New Game Plus quote-unquote adds new enemies into the game, they kind of aren't really added if you played the original patches of the game, because some enemies were taken out after some communal feedback because certain areas were a little bit too punishing for many players. I generally prefer the New Game Plus placement of enemies, but they're just making it more true to the artist's original vision. While more enemies kind of get added, they take away Vestige points, which are kind of like the equivalent of lanterns, sites of grace, bonfires, etc. And while that is well and good, I don't necessarily think it adds a lot more depth to the game by removing these vestiges, especially when you can use an Vestige seed to plant into where the vestiges were, it just makes it so that you're less able to fast travel the further you progress in the new game plus chain of events. I don't think that makes the game better, and I think it makes it actively worse when you're going into new game plus 3 and trying to do the Umbral ending, which requires a lot more backtracking than something like the Radiant ending, which is a lot more straightforward overall. So, right. Ultimately, this makes it more tedious to explore the world fully on New Game Plus, which I kind of feel is almost antithetical to the overall design of the game. So I think it's really just like challenge for challenge's sake, but it's really not that challenging when you can just use the Umbral Seedbeds. So, with that being said, moving away from New Game Plus, I think it is kind of worth talking about the Umbral Seedbeds and Vestige seeds in general, because I think there are just too many Umbral Seedbeds from which you can plant Vestige seeds, which is a little bit counterintuitive because it seems like it would be a good thing, right? Well, when I first played through the game, I beat a boss and I saw that there was an Umbral Seedbed, and I was like, oh, okay, I'll use my very few Vestige seeds so that way I can rest and move on to the next area. Well, after I did that, I moved like maybe, 50 steps, and then I came into the next Vestige point, and so I felt as though that I'd wasted my Vestige seed by moving on to the next area, which kind of disincentivized me from wanting to use my Vestige seeds when I felt that the next Vestige point could always be over the next corner. So, what does that really mean to the player? I think if they either got rid of the superfluous Umbral Seedbed spots, like after certain bosses when the next lantern is right around the corner, it would do better for players to not feel so stingy about using their seeds for their rest points, or if they made it so that it was a non-consumable item, and that way you could place your one Vestige seed rest spot wherever you wanted, players would kind of know and be more free to interact with that. I just don't know what value is gotten from having them be consumable items with a limit of 5 when it's really just going to dissuade newer players from wanting to use it rather than veterans or people with a lot of extra vigor when they can be bought from the shop. And as usual, I will complain incessantly about a game which has a limited amount of resources for respecking your character or upgrading your weapons, because I just don't really think it adds enjoyment to the game. It just makes it more tedious. So give us more rebirth options and make it so that upgrading weapons isn't as painful in terms of how much it costs for purchasing items, because people are probably going to be locked in to certain builds fairly early on because it is a little bit annoying trying to grind out and try different weapons. So this is something that I think Lords of the Fallen plays a little bit too close to Dark Souls in its implementation of features. So if they change that, that'd be great. This ties into quests as well. I do feel like Lords of the Fallen is a little bit too cryptic just for the sake of being cryptic, because that's what players expect from Dark Souls, but I don't think they executed it as well as they could have, because certain quests feel like they end way too early for their own good. At certain points, if you proceed into certain areas, you will end certain NPCs' quests, but it's not very obvious when that's happening. I know certain quests are also kind of bugged where if you do them out of order, they'll break right now. I'm pretty confident the devs said that they're working on that, so we're still kind of waiting for now. But as the game exists right now during the time of this review, I think this is a kind of massive flaw that I hope they address in the near future. So like I've been saying, a lot of my criticisms of the Dark Souls games are kind of also at play here in Lords of the Fallen, where not having a saving system is just a real pain in the ass for no reason. I think the game would be better by having something along with the autosave, so that way players can go back to different sections of the quests before they screw it up unknowingly. And I feel like having to look at guides to figure out a lot of these quests is another pain in the ass, and is something that I think is poor game design and not something that I like to see in the games that I play. Anyway, you're just going to need the guide to figure stuff out. I know certain fans are upset that the seamless co-op mode isn't fully seamless, where you'll be able to complete like 2 story modes based on one person's account. So you'll need to go through like one area on player 1's profile and then the same area on player 2 to like get the same kind of story progression, which is a little bit unfortunate. Although I'm not entirely surprised by that, I do know that certain fans were definitely disappointed by that, which I do think is worth addressing here in case you were looking forward to some co-op with a pal. My biggest complaints about the multiplayer for now are about the reward structures for doing it. In the US, if you avenge a lamp bearer and kill a kind of special souped up enemy, you'll only get 3 umbral eyeballs, whereas in the Australian region, if you do the exact same content, you'll gain 150 eyeballs, presumably because the servers are less populated. I don't know how the publishers have separated the regions to work that way, but anyway, it's a real pain in the ass. I'll make my own video about it because it's kind of math heavy, and the thing that I'll say here is, at least for co-op multiplayer, I think it would make a lot more sense if normal enemies also dropped coins, even if like it was just 1 coin per enemy, or maybe like 2 or 3 coins if the mob is bigger, because relegating it to only dropping coins from bosses just kind of incentivizes players to leave worlds unless they're being beckoned for a boss specifically, because it just takes way too long to gain any rewards for multiplayer. And I do wish there was an offline path for people to gain access to some of these promotional materials, because not always is the game going to be accessible online. My biggest complaint is relegated to the UI. I think it's absolutely ridiculous that in 2023, in order to see how effective a rune is going to be, rather than looking at the menu where you equip them, you need to go out and do manual testing just to see if you're dealing more damage or more status effect buildup. Additionally, you can't see the full flavor text when tabbing through items in the equipment page, so you need to go to the full inventory to find out what they say, which is a real pain in the ass because the inventory doesn't separate categories like helmets and chest pieces, and you can't even sort the inventory, so it becomes even more of a burden to see something so simple. Also, there's this terrible bug right now where they've added icons to show when you picked up a new item, except whenever you invade another world right now, literally every item in your inventory and the shopkeeper's inventories gets flagged as though it's your first time seeing it, so you need to manually clear all of them out, or you just kind of deal with it, which is terrible for somebody with OCD. And lastly, there's a couple visual bugs where if you break open an enemy's posture and deal a grievous blow to them, their posture meter doesn't accurately reflect what's going on with it, so it's a little bit difficult to tell where their posture is after they get back up. And then the other one is holding down the A button doesn't always skip a cutscene, which is kind of really annoying, especially when like opening the game for the first time. I kind of wish they made the first cutscene play after the trailer. The way that I rate games is based on a bell curve, with a 5 being an average, fun, and enjoyable game, and 4 and below being games that are flawed or predatory towards the player, and 6 and above stand a cut progressively above the rest. With this in mind, I'm going to give Lords of the Fallen a 7 out of 10, with the added caveat that I think it could very easily be an 8 out of 10 if they fix a few of the issues I've mentioned in this review. At its core, Lords of the Fallen is a really good game that's held back by a couple systemic issues and a couple issues relating to performance. I know the developers are still trying to fix it now, so I can only hope that in the future the game is even better than it currently is. While I really enjoyed my time playing, it might be worth waiting a couple months for some of these issues to get hammered out before picking it up yourself. I know Lords of the Fallen has had a kind of a rocky start with a bunch of mixed reviews, which I haven't really heard too much about, and I'm kind of curious to dive into myself, So I'm really thinking about streaming some reactions to reviews that others have done about the game, just so I can see where they're coming from, because I did enjoy myself. With that being said, I'm also really curious as to hear your guys' thoughts in the comments about Lords of the Fallen, whether or not you think my score is accurate, what you would give it, what you like, what you dislike, because the kind of polarizing effect that it's had on the community has come as a bit of a surprise to me, so I'm really curious to see why that has come to be the way that it has. So anyway, enough rambling from me. If you enjoyed the review, please do all the cool YouTube stuff of liking, subscribing, and that nonsense. As always, I would like to thank my patrons and channel members for your continued support while I work on these kinds of projects. I really do appreciate it, and hopefully I'll catch you on the next one. Last Protagonist out.